On this build, Oly Homes have behaved like complete and total scum. They've deliberately breached the contract, they ignored the plans, they knowingly breached an Australian standard very intentionally. They even applied an Australian standard that had been out of date 2 months before the contract was signed. And on top of that, they lied about it to the owners, trying to confuse the owners to make what Oly Homes had done acceptable. It is not acceptable. Their behaviour was atrocious. Oly Homes prepared the plans negligently. They were mathematically incapable of being built as drawn. Now, Oly Homes had a choice. They could have fixed it and done the right thing, or they could have done the wrong thing, which is what they chose to do. And this is the first in a series of videos about this build and Oly Homes' conduct and inadequacies. There's going to be several other parts because this is going to be quite long enough to begin with. I'm going to start with some background. A couple in their 80s decided to build a house. I'm going to be referring to them as the owners. They put a lot of thought into the location they wanted this house at, and they sited it so that it would draw a breeze for most of the day. If there's any air about, it'll catch a breeze. And for the views, they considered their needs and potential future needs and put a lot of effort into how they wanted the house laid out. And they wanted a ramp at the back so they could, if necessary, wheel groceries into the house from the garage, and in case either of them ever ended up using walking aids or a wheelchair. Unfortunately for them, the owners hired Oly Homes to build their house. Oly Homes describes themselves as Queensland's leading modular builder. They work out of premises at 66 Pioneer Road, Yandina in Queensland. They prefabricate buildings at their premises in Yandina and deliver them to where the owners have got their sites prepared. Now, there's a lot of information you should know before buying a building from Oly Homes. I'll be addressing some of this in future videos. Things like wall damage in transit that has to be repaired on site, and then the walls have to be repainted so you don't know that you've actually got a house with new but damaged repaired walls instead of a house with new walls. That sort of stuff. A lot of this has got to do with the crane lift, I believe. In this video, there's some things I'm also not going to be talking about, such as security screens that appear to be in no way secure, concrete curing time, and just plain unfinished work. Here we have a side view. The left-hand side of this image is the rear of the property, and the right-hand side is the front section of the property, and the last segment on the right is the balcony. Zooming in on this image, we can see that the top of the floor is supposed to be 800 mil above ground level, and the floor is supposed to be 22 millimeters thick. The site has a gentle slope from the rear toward the front. Now, that doesn't impact upon the fact that the minimum height that is required for the floor to be above the soil level is 800 mil to the top of the floor. So 778 mil to the bottom of the floor. That's a given. Starting at the front corner of the property, I'm going to walk around and take a series of measurements so that we can work out just how high the building is off the ground. If we pause here and we look down, we can see that there is actually a line of gravel where I'm measuring. Now, that line of gravel has been affected by rain running off the house before gutters were installed, and is actually slightly lower than the measurements should be. It's just to the right of the red line. Now, I don't care if my measurements are showing the house to be actually 10 mil taller than it is or 15 mil taller than it is. An accurate measurement would be taken under the fascia to the right where the natural level of the house pad actually is. But for the purposes of this video, my measurements will demonstrate everything quite sufficiently. This is top of the floor level or top of the deck level. The house pad has got a slight slope from the rear of the house toward the front of the house to help with rain runoff. Absolutely standard sort of thing. This is the highest side of the house. At no point on this side of the house is it 800 millimeters off the ground. This is just a single circuit of the building, and I'm taking measurements where it's clear where the exact surface level was, not on piles of earth or anything. It's where the level of the house pad originally was. I'm not putting the tape measure in holes, I'm not putting it on mounds. If we assume that the internal floor is the same height as the deck, we can work out how high above the bottom of the cladding the actual internal floor level is, and we can use that as the basis of our measurements. We're approaching the lowest point of the entire build, which is nowhere near 800 mil. To orient you, this corner is here on the plan. This is 216 millimeters lower than it should be. I'm not trying to be super accurate with these measurements. You can very clearly get the idea that nothing here is anywhere near 800 mil off the ground. Keep your eyes out, the ramp is coming up, and this is the linchpin of Oly Homes' mistakes and reasoning in lowering the house without the consent of the owners. And we're back to very near where we started. So let's start with the basics. Is the entire floor of the building a minimum of 800 mil above the ground? No, none of it is. Have Oly Homes breached their contract? Yes, see previous question and answer. The owners hired a building inspector and had him review the build. He found that, and I quote, "Some of the lowest horizontal members are under 150 millimeters to ground level. This is in contradiction to the Building Code of Australia, Volume 2, Table 3.4.1.2. The QBCC have put out a handy summary of how this standard applies. I have linked it in the description, and this is a quote from it. 400 millimeters of clearance between structural components and the ground. 400 millimeters. Anything less than 400 millimeters means Oly Homes have failed to comply with a necessary Australian standard and that they have breached their contract. A different count of breaching their contract to the first failure to build in accordance with the plans. There is an exception to this rule for what is a sloping site, and I will be addressing this later in the video. Looking at the images contained in his report, one of them looks like it's 130 and another looks like it's barely 100. That's supposed to be 400 mil there, Oly Homes. 400 mil. Or it's non-compliant. Well done, Oly Homes, well done. Despite this obvious non-compliance, Oly Homes actually found a building certifier who was prepared to sign off on this build as compliant with all Australian standards and building codes. Yep, as Sir Humphrey Appleby would have said, that is very courageous. Now, I'm guessing that certifier is becoming increasingly nervous about this. He never attended the site once. You know, you'd think that would be a prerequisite to signing off on a certification of a site. So where did he get his information from that made him think Oly Homes had complied with everything they were supposed to comply with? Was the conduit Oly Homes? Well, maybe he shouldn't have trusted Oly Homes. The owner's building inspector measured the low point at the back left at, generously, 125 mil. I went and I measured the right-hand side lowest points under each of the cross members. The figures in green are estimates based upon the 125 mil at the back and the increases in height I observed on the right. What you won't see here is any heights of 400 or more, which is what is required throughout. I'm using a simplified diagram here. The actual subfloor, the lowest parts, are 12 beams in this sort of configuration. So now we come to Oly Homes' response to a complaint that the house is too low and that the floor level isn't 100 millimeters off the ground. I've separated this into two parts because it makes more sense this way. The house pad is out of level. Here they've said something that's actually true. So, well done. A house pad is not allowed to be level. If it's level, surface water will accumulate on the property. A building site is required to have a slight slope to permit water runoff. So yes, the house pad is not perfectly level. It's not allowed to be under the National Construction Code. The house itself is level. That's not my field of expertise. In the signed specification under the exclusion section, it states the client is responsible for the provision of the site pad which is not level. Yep, the client provided the site pad which is not level. That's true, but I think you meant to put a comma in there. The site pad, comma, which is not level. Yep, on which of your inspections did you raise the issue? When did you ever bring this up prior to starting construction? Well, okay, it's not true, this complaint, but we'll just move on. The sloping house pad appears the cause of this issue, which is the client's responsibility and is not a building defect. Somehow, a very gentle slope on a block of land has caused Oly Homes to make this build 230 mil lower than it should be. Yeah, right. Let's have a look at this. Floor level at the rear of the building is 584 millimeters. The floor level, or the deck level, at the very front of the building is 665 millimeters. That gives us these 2 points here. 81 millimeters of fall, assuming the house is level, across more than 10 meters. That is insignificant. That is nothing. Only an idiot would believe that Oly Homes had to cut all of this box steel down to the heights they did because there is some kind of slope issue. Oly Homes are happily insulting the intelligence of the owners by even coming up with such a preposterous response. It's nothing but lies. Or, alternatively, there is the possibility Oly Homes can't build on anything but 100% non-compliant with the National Construction Code sites. They are either so useless they can't build anywhere, or they're lying. Now, I'm going to say they're lying. Now, this is not a sloping site, but for the sake of completion, on a sloping site, the National Construction Code and various Australian standards say that you may have part of the undercarriage of the build at the lowest point a minimum of 150 millimeters off the ground, provided that within 2 meters of that point, the height reverts to 400 off the ground. Oly Homes have used the words sloping site. Did they treat it as a sloping site by having part of the build at 150 mil off the ground and within 2 meters? Yeah, okay, they were under 150 mil, so they didn't comply with that part of it, and at no point are the lowest parts of the undercarriage 400 mil off the ground, let alone within 2 meters of the back. So, no. Okay, it is not and never was a sloping site, and Oly Homes has used the words sloping site to try and add further confusion. Here is the rest of the response, and this is where it gets interesting. The home has been placed so that the ramp was installed at 7 degrees, which is the required angle and determining factor. Well, there's a lot wrong with this statement for a start. Determining factor for what, you half-wit? Let's have a little look at this ramp, shall we? Now, if we go and look at the plans, we see that the plans were either negligently drawn or Oly Homes always intended to get rid of a short ramp. The plans tell us that the ramp is supposed to be 4,667 millimeters long, and it's supposed to be at a slope of 1:8. Now, that was the correct slope for a ramp more than 2 months before this contract was signed. At the signing date of this contract, ramps were required to be 1:14. Setting that aside for now, taking the height of 800 millimeters and a length of 4,667, we can work out how long the ramp should be, and we can measure it. The ramp should be 4,606 millimeters long. Running a tape, we can see that the ramp is actually the correct length, or the length that is specified in the plans. Let's have a look at the negligence. You see, Oly Homes could never build that ramp and have it comply with the rest of the plans and the ramp requirements that were in place 2 months before the contract was signed. It is mathematically impossible. To work out the maximum height the highest point of the ramp could be according to the plans, we start at the base of the ramp, and we've got a measurement there of 120. That is the depth of the ramp. That has to be discounted for mathematical purposes. What is the actual angle of an 8-to-1 sloping ramp? Oly Homes say it's 7 degrees, but at this stage I don't believe anything they say. Oh, surprise, look, it's 7.125 degrees. Oly Homes are only off by 1/8 of a degree. Now, using the actual correct angle and the length of the ramp as per the plans, how high can it possibly be? The answer is a fraction under 580 millimeters. Now, if we go back and we add in that 120 mil from the base of the ramp, which doesn't affect the angle, we've got 700 millimeters. The maximum height at the top of the ramp, according to the plans, is 700 millimeters. It is supposed to be at least 800. I'm calling this negligence for very clear reasons. A builder owes a duty of care to someone they're preparing plans for to get them right. Oly Homes didn't do that. They owe a duty of care to their clients, their customers, the owners, and they did not get the plans right. If the lowest point on this build is 230 mil lower than it should be, then this ramp is 230 mil lower than it should be. How high is it? I taped it at 615 mil. Adding 230, it should be 845. So is the piece of human garbage in Oly Homes' management team who responded to the owner's complaint actually correct? Is the ramp at 7 degrees. Well, no. No, I get 6.054 degrees. Nearly a degree out. Now this might be accounted for by Oly Homes failing to take off 120 mil, being the width of the ramp. So they may genuinely think it's at 7 degrees because they can't count. I don't know. So the piece of human garbage is saying that the ramp angle is paramount over all Australian building codes, over the contract, which they just blatantly breached, but that's okay because the angle of the ramp is the overriding factor, the determining factor. What a piece of... In case there's any doubt, this is not true. Oly Homes have effectively varied the contract without it being in writing in breach of the QBCC Act, regardless of whether or not Nathan said anything. And while we're talking about lies, the owner says the last sentence here, no conversation happened. Oh, by the way, we're going to have to lower the build by 230 mil because the ramp is too short. Any sane person would say, get a longer ramp. Do not lower the build. Get a ramp the right length. This conversation, I'm sure this never happened. I'm positive this never happened. A variation of contract of this magnitude requires a variation to the contract signed by all parties. Not someone casually saying, by the way, we're going to do this. Never happened. Personally, I think Oly Homes always intended to breach this contract and build other than in accordance with the plans and breach Australian standards. Just not the ramp standard, because they'd be made to fix that and that would cost them money. They don't think they'll get made to raise this build because it's too expensive to raise the build, now that they have deliberately dumped this house down to nearly on the ground. First, as already discussed, the ramp could only ever be 700 mil high and not 800 if the ramp was to be compliant. It's not the most important thing ever in all Australian standards, even though Oly Homes are asserting it is. Second, this build is 230 mil lower than it should be. Does this mean that it would have complied with the Australian standards on height if it was 230 mil taller? No, we're talking about Oly Homes here. Of course not. They were always going to breach an Australian standard that they didn't think it would cost them any money to fix. Probably most damning of all is point 3. They never attended the site. They had no way of knowing how high the top of the ramp would have to be or how long the ramp would have to be unless they had mapped out the site and worked out the varying heights across the site so they knew what the height of the site was at the top of the ramp. That is when they should have said, we need a ramp this long, not that long. Oh no, I think they were always planning on jamming this build down to the ground so that that ramp would be compliant, which means, in my opinion, they went into this contract intending to breach it. Now, I've gone on for quite long enough for one video. I will be doing more. Oly Homes have not just behaved badly to do with the height of the build. They have behaved badly in contract negotiations and breached acts as they please throughout the build. Oh, we don't need to put up a sign. We don't want anyone to know who the builder here is because we know we're going to do a rubbish job on the height. Yeah, okay, makes sense from an advertising perspective. While you're waiting for the second video in this series, I will strongly urge you to go with someone other than Queensland's apparently leading builder of modular homes. Go with a local builder who's got a reputation in the area to protect. They can't be any worse, can they? Okay, that's me done. Australian consumer signing out for now. I'll catch you next time.